All right, let's jump right into this explainer and completely demystify the foundational myth of Rome. We're looking way back to the traditional date of 753 BC. Now, this is a time totally steeped in legends you might already be familiar with, twin brothers, a nurturing wolf, the marking out of a legendary city. But today, we're going to look at these events by examining how different ancient historians, specifically Plutarch and Livy, actually shaped the very story we know today. We're going to see exactly how they approach the tale with skepticism, competing versions, and, especially in Plutarch's case, a growing sense of moral unease. Right off the bat, we're confronted with two wildly different visions of Rome's founding. On one side, we've got divine providence, right? A miraculous survival story where nature itself, in the form of a wolf, steps in to save the founders. But on the other side, we have this stark, gritty human reality centered around something completely different, a brother killing a brother. This split shows us something absolutely vital right from the outset. History isn't just a simple list of facts. It's a narrative that comes to us through deeply interpretive traditions, and the interpretation itself is doing a whole lot of heavy lifting here. Section 1, the Roman tradition. A complicated backstory. Okay, so this sequence lays out the classic mythological backdrop, and it is pretty dramatic. It starts in an ancient Latin city called Alba Longa. A man named Amulius usurps the throne from his brother, Numitor. To lock down his stolen power, Amulius forces Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a perpetual celibate, a Vestal virgin. But, as ancient myths always seem to go, she ends up bearing twins to the god Mars. Naturally, Amulius is furious and orders the babies thrown into the Tiber River, but the basket miraculously washes ashore. Here, the famous she-wolf suckles them until a shepherd named Faustulus finds and raises them. It's honestly the perfect legendary setup before the twins grow up, discover their true identities, restore their grandfather to his throne, and finally decide to go off and found a city of their own. Now, what's really fascinating here is when we look closely at how our two historians handle this famous she-wolf, we see their unique lenses instantly come into play. Livy, writing about a century before Plutarch, has this temperament that comfortably just lets a great story stand. He treats the wolf almost as a solid fact. He does mention a rationalist alternative, like, hey, maybe she was just a local shepherdess, but he really doesn't insist on it. Plutarch, by contrast, is way more guarded. He cautiously labels the whole wolf-suckling thing merely as a tradition. So already, these historical lenses are shifting our view of the past.
Moving on to Section 2, the founding quarrel, a fatal dispute.
The absolute key takeaway here is that right from the very start, Romulus and Remus were driven by this harsh, unyielding desire for ultimate power. As Plutarch points out, they resolved to live by themselves in a brand new place rather than just add to some existing city's population. They flat out refused to be subjects, they refused to be slaves, they wanted command, and they wanted dominion, which perfectly sets the stage for a tragic clash. And this right here brings us to the core of their fatal argument. To settle a massive dispute over where exactly to build the city, because Romulus wanted the Palatine Hill and Remus preferred the Aventine, they agreed to look for a sign from the gods through the birds. But the sign ended up being a total logistical nightmare. Remus saw 6 vultures first, Romulus saw 12 vultures, but later. Both parties immediately claimed the gods' favor based on conflicting interpretations of the exact same bird omen. I mean, think about it. Was the winner the guy who saw the birds first, or the guy who saw the most? It's basically the ultimate ancient technicality. So when this argument inevitably boils over into violence, watch how our historians handle it, because it's very different. From words, they fell to blows. Livy just plainly and directly reports the brutal murder. He says Remus, in derision, leaped over Romulus's newly built wall, and Romulus literally killed him in a fit of rage. Boom, presented plainly. Plutarch, however, troubledly distances himself from the grim reality. He notes the tradition isn't exactly certain on whose hand struck the fatal blow, though he does admit the more common account definitely points to Romulus himself. We've got to remember that these ancient sources are not just listing out sterile facts. They are actively applying moral lenses to weigh the dark, heavy costs of empire building. Livy's account is largely comfortable with Romulus as the founder, just kind of accepting the violence as part of that founding moment. Plutarch, on the other hand, keeps signaling that the killing of Remus is a profound problem. For him, it is a persistent moral shadow that really counts against Romulus. By comparing them, we realize that history itself acts as an interpretive tool. It's a great reminder for us even today, honestly. Historical accounts don't necessarily prove one side right or wrong. Rather, they reveal how writers frame the past to communicate moral weight.
Section 3, the Sabine women, violence and union.
All right, so Rome had a huge problem. They needed people. Romulus basically populated Rome by making it a massive sanctuary. declaring an open settlement for fugitives, outcasts, runaway slaves, exiles, you name it. Unsurprisingly, the population exploded quickly. But there was a massive demographic issue. They had almost no women. To solve this, Romulus orchestrated an act of calculated systemic violence. He invited the neighboring Sabine people over to a festival. Then, using a prearranged signal, his men simply seized the Sabine women to be their wives by force. What's actually mind-blowing here is how Plutarch frames the aftermath of this real violence. Years later, when the Sabine men finally came back with an army to retake their daughters, a massive battle began. Plutarch totally acknowledges the original brutal violence, the swords and the slaughter, but he heavily emphasizes the incredible moral agency of the women. They literally threw themselves between their Roman husbands and Sabine fathers, weeping and carrying their little children. It was the women who ultimately forced the men to lay down their arms, creating an agreement to actually reign together. And this paints a really sharp contrast with the Greek founder Theseus, a figure Plutarch explicitly compares to Romulus. Both men founded societies involving the abduction of women. Theseus abducted Antiope, the Amazon, for instance. But Theseus's actions did not turn into political unions. Romulus's terrible act, however, surprisingly birthed a genuine, lasting political union between two entirely different nations. Out of a deeply ambiguous, incredibly violent beginning, something genuinely structurally solid emerged, a joint sovereignty. Section 4. The End of Romulus, Two Paths. 37. According to the texts, Romulus reigned all by himself over his unified city for about 37 years. After almost 4 decades of absolute rule, he faced a highly suspicious disappearance. And here is where we get the ultimate glaring tension between myth and reality, right? Side by side. The Roman tradition heavily favored the mythical death, that during a great storm at the Capraean Marsh outside the city, Romulus was magically snatched up by divine power and turned into the god Quirinus. But Plutarch leaves a much colder alternative right there on the page. He records a gritty reality that he takes quite seriously, that Romulus was actually assassinated by the senators in a private chamber, his body cut to pieces and completely concealed. A glorious elevation to the heavens versus a brutal, covert political assassination. Plutarch makes this brilliant little observation here. He points out that legends of disappearances persist simply because they serve a much better political purpose. I mean, it is far more useful to have a cult dedicated to the divine founder Quirinus than admitting the incredibly inconvenient story that the founder of your great city was brutally murdered by his own politicians. Which brings us to Section 5. The character of a founder. Looking squarely through Plutarch's lens, Romulus is undeniably revealed as the harder founder. When we compare them side by side, Theseus is generous, he relies on persuasion, and he's willing to share power to unify the Attic villages. Romulus is far more guarded. He doesn't persuade, he commands. He doesn't share power, he reigns alone. His entire portrait is forever shadowed by the killing of his brother and the original violent act of seizing the Sabine women, absolutely regardless of the union that followed. But here's the thing. Despite all his brutal methods, the commands, and the moral shadows hanging over his legacy, the undeniable fact remains. Theseus's Athens flowered briefly, but the city Romulus built endured for a millennium. Rome stood for 1,000 years. The sheer scale of the city's eventual success completely dwarfs the dark, ambiguous origins of its foundation. So I want to leave you with this final, lingering question, something Plutarch himself wrestled with. Considering the fratricide, the abductions, and the absolute rule, did Rome thrive because of this morally complex man, or did it thrive entirely in spite of him? Thank you so much for walking through this explainer with me.